Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chinese History Podcast. I'm your host, Yiming Ha. Today we welcome onto the show Andrew Chittick, the E. Leslie Peter Professor of East Asian Humanities at Eckerd College in Florida. Professor Chittick's research focus is the culture of early South China and maritime trade relations with Southeast Asia. His other research interests include Asian food cultures, Silk Road and maritime archaeology, and global comparative and spatial history. He is the author of two books, Patronage and Community in Medieval China and The Jiankang Empire in Chinese and World History. Professor Chittick joins us today to talk more about the Jiankang Empire, or the regimes of the Han Chinese in South China during the period we know as the Northern and Southern Dynasties. Thank you, Professor Chittick, for coming to the show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Yiming.
So 2 episodes ago, I interviewed Professor Scott Pearce, and we talked a little bit about the Northern Wei regime up in North China. So I just wanted to get you onto the show as well and talk a little bit about what was going on in South China. This was during the period of the 6 dynasties from 220 CE to 589 CE roughly, also known as the period of disunion or the Northern and Southern Dynasties, where China was split into 2. So I just want to start off by asking you if you can walk us through the formation of the Southern Dynasties. What was happening in China during this time that caused it to split into the rival regimes, where you have a regime of non-ethnic Han Chinese in the north, and then you have ethnic Han Chinese in the south? What was going on during this period?
So Wu was in the Yangtze Delta, and it founded the city which would come to be called Jiankang. It was originally called Jianye at modern Nanjing, basically the same place, and made that its capital. And the Wu state was able to defend itself against the Wei regime in the north, which was much larger. It had conquered essentially all of the Yellow River Plains. Mostly it was able to do that because it controlled the Yangtze River, which was hard to cross. But also to some extent because the Wei rulership was not very territorially ambitious to conquer the south for a generation or two in the mid-3rd century. Not until the rise of the Sima clan, who founded the Jin regime in 265 and eventually conquered Wu in 280. But that northern rule by the Jin regime lasted for barely more than a generation before the regime collapsed in civil war and the Jiankang regime asserted its independence again, this time on a much more lasting sort of way. And this new Jiankang regime had a couple of advantages that the 3 kingdom state of Wu did not have. I'll just highlight 2. First of all, it has a ruling group that claimed legitimacy as heirs of the Jin. So that brought in a lot of people that were familiar with things like imperial court ritual and bureaucracy and traditional texts and treatises on government and all that kind of stuff, which honestly, the 3 kingdoms Wu regime had been pretty short in that kind of expertise. I call that an advantage, but it also led to substantial tension with the native Wu ruling class and also the military, which was mostly not controlled by the imperial clan, but instead commanded by dominant personalities and their families. Some of those were immigrant, some of those were local. A second really big advantage for the 4th century Jiankang regime was that the north was in total chaos under the 16 kingdoms. And that meant that they had a long stretch where there was not really much military threat coming from the north. And they were able over the next 100 years or so slowly to develop a stronger forward defensive line. Instead of it being on the Yangtze River, it was mostly along the Huai River. And at some points, it actually extended all the way far north as the Yellow River. So this made for a substantially stronger regime.
So we all know that South China during this period was much less populated than North China. The economic center, the population center was up in the north along the Yellow River. So how did South China handle and accommodate this sudden influx of refugee populations from the north? You had mentioned that there were already native clans living there. So did it lead to any tensions with the local population? Were there any problems, civil unrest, and that sort of stuff?
Well, that's a good question, and it really brings up a kind of longstanding myth that South China in this period was primarily populated from migrants from North China. They're usually described as Han Chinese. That idea goes all the way back to an article by Tan Xishan in the 1930s, where he roughly estimates that about 1/6 of the population of the South was Northern immigrants. But more recent studies by scholars like Wang Yumin, Ge Jianshang, Hua Xiang, including also some of my own work, suggest the actual figure is actually not more than about 5% of the population. And actually, half of that were people who were from the area of the lower Huai River, that is what's now modern northern Jiangsu and southern Shandong. Those were actually considered people of Chu, not northerners. And so the migrant population of people from the Yellow River Plains is probably not more than about 2% of the population. In addition, most of the population growth in this period that we can track was probably due to the natural growth of the local population, eventually also due to better registration and census. It's not due to a massive influx of people from the north. 2% is not nothing. It's probably 100, 200,000 people. That's significant, but it's not nearly the kind of overwhelming number of migrants that's usually ascribed to it. All of that said, to get back to your original question, yes, the migration of even that number of northerners in the early 4th century, which is the primary wave of it, did cause tensions because often they were armed bands and they were looking to sort of establish themselves. And so they had conflict with locals and they did not always mix well with the locals. There's lots of evidence of conflict with locals trying to send them back to the north. And so there's significant pockets of immigrant communities, especially in certain areas scattered around the Yangtze Delta region and then other significant groups in mostly the central Yangtze region, mostly in Hubei. And also along the Huai River frontier, where those pockets of migrants from the north had a really substantial impact.
I'm currently listening to an ebook in Chinese about the Northern and Southern Dynasties. And when they were talking about the formation of the Southern Dynasties, the author said that these Northern refugees, when they came to the South, they were more privileged in government and society. There were also kind of different population registrations created for them. Like, is that true? And if so, like, how did that work?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Though calling them more privileged is a little complicated. Some of them are privileged and relatively well educated and wind up being really important in the court at Jiankang. Lots of them are not particularly well educated, especially those ones from Chu, who are usually thought of as northern migrants, but aren't exactly northerners. A lot of them are lower class military men or other groups. The Jiankang regime tries to accommodate them by creating special administrative categories for them, basically creating kind of districts for immigrant people that don't really have a home, right? They're housed in a district that actually has regular territory, and then the district of northerners has a kind of a special category. And usually those groups are not on the regular registers, that is the census registration by the central court. That sounds like a big deal, and it is, though it's worth pointing out that already, even by the Western Jin period, the registration system had largely fallen apart. So the evidence suggests that maybe no more than about 25% of the population is registered, or is registered by the central court, I should say. There's almost certainly registration going on by local rulers and warlords and so on that have local registration. And those immigrant districts probably also had some kind of local registration in some cases. So there is a certain advantage to being in an immigrant district because you don't have corvée and taxes, but I think that was actually true for a lot of Southerners as well. It's just that it's hard to tell because since they're not registered, we don't really know about them.
That's interesting. I mean, in some ways, it kind of reminds me of what was going on in Taiwan when Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT regime moved there. I mean, you had all these representatives of provinces in mainland China that, they don't control, but they still have that kind of category for them. Since you brought up the issue of corvée and taxes, we know from research now that during this period, the bulk of government revenues came from taxation, land tax, agricultural tax, and corvée labor of the population. But it seemed like in South China at this time, something else was going on. That didn't seem to play a big of a role as it did in North China, where we see the implementation of the equal field system later on. So with that said, with the bulk of the population in the north and the economic center being in the north, how did the southern regimes sustain itself financially?
Well, that's another good question that opens up a certain misconception about this period. By the 5th and early 6th century, it's quite likely that the southern regimes had an equal or even greater population to the northern ones, partly because they control a significant amount of land in what's now sort of central China and the Huai River and even up towards the Yellow River, partly because the population in the north had collapsed so badly in the 4th century. Economically, the southern regimes are almost indisputably more prosperous than the northern ones. I'll just give you an example. The northern regimes used grain and cloth for trade and virtually no coinage. The southern economy was highly monetized. It used bronze coins, eventually in the 6th century iron coins, and gold and silver in the far south. In fact, it was so prosperous that there was a continuous shortage of currency. It was hard for the government to generate enough coinage. The Song dynasty, the later Song dynasty, the Zhao Song dynasty, had the same problem. The real weakness of the southern regimes, and this is what you were addressing, was the fiscal system. They had a terrible census, which probably registered and taxed maybe a fifth of the population and even less of the land value. What happens is they become dependent instead on commercial taxes, sales taxes, transit taxes, and so forth. In addition, the elite of the southern regimes was very much engaged in trading activities, and they profited a lot from taking advantage of their official positions. Now, if you look at what historians write about that, they usually regard all of this very negatively. That is, they characterize it as a combination of incompetence and corruption. But if you think comparatively, it's not unlike the way that other major world empires were run. I compared it to the way the Roman Empire functioned. And it had one significant advantage, which is that it made the ruling class a lot more supportive of policies that promoted trade and economic development because they benefited from that personally.
So who are they trading with? The Southeast Asian states, Japan, Korea, were these the trading partners?
First of all, a lot of the trade is internal, right? I mean, the Jiankang regime extends from the Yangtze Delta all the way to Sichuan and all the way down to what's now northern Vietnam. So there's a lot of opportunity for trade internally. And because the river systems are really well developed, the central government didn't have to build a lot of roads or that kind of stuff. The transportation network was already built into the environment. But they were also very involved in maritime trade. You don't see so much maritime trade there's some with Japan and Korea, but I think by far the more important trade goes down to Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asians sailed all of the ships. When I say maritime trade, it's Southeast Asian ships that are bringing the maritime trade to the empire. And they brought it all the way to the Yangtze Delta at this time. Jiankang itself is a major seaport. In fact, it's the first large Chinese city and court to also be a seaport. You aren't going to see that again until Hangzhou in the southern Song. So Southeast Asian sailing ships sailed up to Jiankang and also to Guangzhou and Jiaozhi, which is northern Vietnam, trading goods from Southeast Asia. There were all kinds of aromatics and woods and kingfisher feathers and turtles and all kinds of exotic goods from Southeast Asia that were traded, as well as goods coming from as far away as India and the Middle East, like frankincense, for example, or cotton cloth. And so that is certainly one part of the Jiankang Empire's prosperity comes from that kind of trade. And we actually have perfectly good evidence from a great account that the prince in the Southern Qi period is trading silk with Southeast Asian traders right out of the harbor in the Yangtze. And so he's very much involved in that trade and has connections with Southeast Asian traders. There's also substantial diaspora community of Southeast Asians in Jiankang, as well, surely also in Guangzhou and Jiaozhi, which we know somewhat less about. So, and they were prestigious. They had money. They contributed money to Buddhist institutions. Some of the heads of those Buddhist institutions were also from Southeast Asia that had come up to settle. So there's really a very active commercial interchange, but also religious and intellectual and even some political interchange with Southeast Asian states.
Well, that's actually a really great point. I mean, when we think about commercial trade, maritime trade, we tend to think of the Southern Song, right, as that period when there's a lot of trade. But it seemed this was going on much, much earlier than the Song. And it really, I think, overturns the stereotype of places like Jiaozhi and Guangzhou during this period as the wilderness populated by these non-ethnic Chinese barbarians. But it seemed like it was very prosperous down there during this time.
It were. The evidence is clear that Jiaozhi in particular, which I think is usually kind of overlooked in favor of Guangzhou. Guangzhou was kind of a new development, but Jiaozhi had been the critical node in the maritime trading network from Southeast Asia since well before the Han Dynasty. The reason the Han wanted to conquer it was precisely because it was such an important commercial node. And so the evidence is clear that it was extremely prosperous. It had a very lively Buddhist community. It had people from as far away as Samarkand living there. And so it played a really key role in the commercial trading network, which basically in the Jiankang period moves its way up all the way to the city of Jiankang.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, let's talk about another aspect of the southern regimes, which was its attempts at militarily reconquering the north. We know that there was, among some levels of the elites, there was this irredentism, like we got to retake, Luoyang, Chang'an, this ancestral territory. And during periods of time, they were quite successful, right? Huan Wen, for instance, and then of course Liu Yu probably had the most success, the founder of the Liu Song regimes, in reconquering North China. But these northern expeditions, or the success of these northern expeditions, were rather ephemeral. The northern regimes retake this territory. And then after that, there were attempts at reconquest, but ultimately these weren't successful. So why was it so difficult for these southern regimes to take North China? We know the first one to actually do it was Zhuge all the way down in the Ming. So why was it so difficult to take North China from the south?
Well, I'm going to answer that in two ways. First, and I think the most important, is that it's not that clear that they really wanted to. There are certainly irredentist writings, and especially in the 4th century under the Eastern Jin, the ideology of retaking the north was quite important. But when you get to Liu Yu, it's not clear he was really trying to conquer the north. He doesn't actually come terribly close. For example, he never tries to advance to the Northern Wei capital of Pingcheng and actually take them out. He, in fact, never staged any significant campaign north of the Yellow River. If you look at his military objectives, they look more like piecemeal opportunistic campaigns to reinforce his northern frontier. For example, seizing the south bank of the Yellow River so he could use that as a sort of a river-based defensive line against the north seems to be a very important objective for him. It's also important to remember that he's illiterate and uneducated. There's no reason to think he has some grand vision of refounding the Han Imperium the way that literate men in this period did. So I think the number one reason why the South doesn't actually reconquer the North in the 5th to 6th centuries is that the military leadership, which is mostly native Southerners, wasn't much interested in it. They were more concerned with protecting their own very prosperous empire against the imperialist efforts of the North. That said, the military question of why there was a frontier between the two at all is quite interesting. I mean, if you look at the map of China, it just looks flat, right? I mean, like, why can't you just move your armies across it? And it really comes down to changes in terrain. If you're in the north and you're on horseback, then the region of rice cultivation, which really starts around the Huai River or so, roughly, is much more difficult than the region of dry grassland cultivation further north. It also has a lot of tropical diseases to which the northerners were more prone. And the northern regimes also had very little experience with river-based warfare, so they couldn't control the waterways, especially the Yangtze, but also the Huai, and manage the safe crossing of their troops. If you're in the south, they had a severe shortage of horses, so they had no hope of fighting with the northern armies in the open field. So what they did instead was invest in fortified garrisons along the riverways, which would force the North, if they did invade, to slow down and engage in siege warfare, and then the South could resupply rapidly by ships up the rivers. That worked pretty well as a defensive system. It was deeply tested only once in the war in 450 CE, and they temporarily gave up a lot of territory, but the overall system held, you could argue. The problem with that is once you get to the northern end of the waterways, which is basically waterways draining south into the Huai River, you're stuck. You have to move forward on ox carts, which were no match for northern cavalry. So as a result, the Huai River watershed is really a natural military frontier, as well as being an ecological, linguistic, and cultural frontier.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if they really tried, whether or not they would have been successful. It's an interesting question to think about. I mean, Zhuge was also in Nanjing, and he was at the end successful in retaking North China.
Fundamental military thing you would have had to do is build a permanent canal that would get you from the Yangtze and Huai watersheds to the Yellow watershed so that you could move your fleet onto the Yellow River. And in fact, they tried to do this, but they were building temporary canals, and in dry years, they dried up. So, I mean, as we all know, you only got a permanent canal when the Grand Canal was built under the Sui, because the North, once it had conquered the South, recognized that it needed to be able to move military equipment south by ship and, of course, move tax grain north by ship, and it needed that canal to make the empire work. But that was a very major undertaking, and it would have been very difficult to do if you could not have protected the canal route while you were building it. And that would have been very difficult for the South because they didn't have the cavalry forces to protect it from the North. So, and honestly, I would say they didn't try really hard to do that. That's part of the reason why I would say I think their interest in retaking the North was not as much as some of the writings that they produced suggest it was.
That's very interesting. So, there's all sorts of anecdotes about the rulers of the southern regimes. Like some of them are messed up, like what these emperors are doing. But I'm thinking in particular, the longest reigning emperor in the south was Xiaoyan, founder of the Southern Liang. And he is most known for being really into Buddhism. And we also know at the same time in North China, there was also a flourishing of Buddhism within the Northern Wei. How did the developments of Buddhism in South China differ from developments in the North? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, Buddhism was every bit as important in the southern regimes as in the North, but it seems to have followed a somewhat different pattern. So let me give you an example. There's no evidence for the kind of local, semi-rural Buddhist organizations that left small cave temples and inscriptions all over Shanxi, and which Scott Pearce referred to in your previous podcast. The ruling elite in the South also does not seem to have invested in the kind of giant Buddhist sculpture grottos like those at Yungang and Longmen. The result of this is that our material evidence for Buddhism is just a lot less. What seems likely is that Buddhist institutions in the South were concentrated in urban areas. They were tightly linked to the flow of commercial wealth and to court patronage, and they were mostly centered on temples that were built out of wood, which did not survive nearly as well as the stone building material of the North. What did survive from the South was written materials, translations from Sanskrit, also religious treatises that worked out the details of Buddhist doctrine, especially how to make it work in a Confucian cultural context and how to align it with imperial ideology. The overwhelming majority of written work on Buddhism from this period comes from the South, not from the North. A lot of monks came to Jiankang from India and Southeast Asia, mostly via maritime routes, to be part of this movement. Buddhism in the South, I think, also had a different emphasis than what was seen in the North. You mentioned Xiaoyan, Liang Emperor Wu. So the role of the emperor as a patron of Buddhism was really modeled on the Emperor Ashoka from the Mauryan Empire in India in the 3rd century BCE. And so was the role of the Bodhisattva. So we can see this especially under Liang Emperor Wu in the first half of the 6th century. He took Bodhisattva vows. He was very pious. He even claimed to be a Chakravartin, or a Buddhist ruler of the entire Buddhist world, extending all the way to India. He had tributary relations with Sri Lanka, for example, and with states in Southeast Asia. By comparison, though, southern rulers never claimed to be an incarnation of the Buddha, as northern rulers sometimes did. And there was also never any purge of Buddhism, right? In the North, there was a purge of Buddhism in the mid-400s, and then again in the 570s. There's nothing like that in the South. So that suggests that there was no major element of the southern ruling class that was opposed to Buddhism. There was basically very widespread support amongst the ruling class for Buddhism, not only as an institution, but also as a part of imperial ideology.
Do we know if there's any exchange of Buddhist monks between North and the South? Because there's some works being done now on a more East Asian context about Buddhist diplomacy being conducted between Japan, Korea, China. So I was just wondering if there was any kind of Buddhist exchanges between North China and South China during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Buddhists are moving back and forth informally. They're sending letters to each other. They're moving back and forth. They're sending scriptures to each other. One of the difficulties with sort of thinking about Southern Buddhism as being different from Northern Buddhism is they're talking to each other all the time and learning from each other all the time. So when I say the South seems to be more interested in the Emperor Ashoka, by the late 6th century, the North is too, right? That is, they're talking to each other. So the changes move back and forth very quickly. I think that has to be seen in a much larger sort of Buddhist context, as you just referenced, right? You also have very substantial Buddhist exchange between the Southern regime and Korea, Paikje, in what's now southwestern Korean peninsula, and also with Japan, as well as with Southeast Asian states, and frankly with Central Asia as well. The Southern regimes have routes to Central Asia that don't go through the Northern Wei. They go up the Han River or up into Sichuan and then cross up into what's now Gansu, basically. And so they have a really widespread sort of Buddhist network, and Buddhist monks are sometimes used as diplomatic emissaries because they tended to have linguistic ability and be able to move between different political spheres easily. So yeah, is absolutely an exchange of Buddhist monks and ideas between the South and the North, but I think you have to see that in a larger context of what's sometimes called the Buddhosphere of exchange going in all directions, not just between the South and the North.
One other thing I wanted to touch on was about the society during this period. One of the readings that we tend to assign in these survey courses on Chinese history is the writings by Yan Zhitui for his descendants. He was an official from the South who fled to the North as a result of a political purge. And he reflected on the differences between Northern society and Southern society regarding especially women. So I was just wondering, in South China, where you don't see this strong influence of the steppe nomads, what did the society there look like? Would you say it's closer to what was like in the Han Dynasty, or was it more of a native development?
That's a really good question. Yan Zhitui is really fun to read because he's nice and clear about a lot of things, and he notes a bunch of cultural differences. I think one of the most interesting is in the role of women. Yan Zhitui says they had a much more public life in the North, where they went out in public freely, they managed the social life of their families, they even engaged in things like lawsuits and politics. Women in the South, he says, were mostly sequestered, marital relations were much more formal. He seems to like the Southern style. He blames the Northern style on basically the influence of steppe nomadic people. Another difference he highlights is linguistic. Yan Zhitui is very concerned with language, and so he discusses differences in phonology between the two capital regions. The language of the court and capital at Jiankang was ultimately based on the Luoyang dialect, which was brought south by high-status immigrants in the early 4th century. But over the subsequent several centuries, it had developed a lot of Southern habits. We don't know exactly what all of those are. They have to do with certain changes in pronunciation and word usage and so on. Meanwhile, of course, the Northerners had adopted a whole lot of Xianbei-influenced speech styles themselves, right? So the two languages had really diverged pretty substantially. It's also really important to note that Yan Zhitui says that most of the other Southern languages, including in the Wu region, which was immediately around the capital, are also quite different, and he doesn't even want to address them. And the evidence suggests that they were probably based on non-Sinitic languages, possibly Austroasiatic or Austronesian languages, or in the interior, the Tai-Kadai family group. Those languages did become partly Sinicized over time, though, much as the Vietnamese language did in later times, right? That is, it's an Austroasiatic language with a very substantial Sinitic influence. To go to your question about whether the Southerners looked like the Han or looked more like something else, I think one of the challenges with making sense out of that is that a lot of aspects of Southern culture seem to us now as quintessentially Chinese, but that's in part because we don't appreciate how different the society of North China was. So let me just give you an example from food culture, right? So Southerners primarily ate rice, of course, and ate fish and drank tea. And all of that seems pretty unremarkable as to now, right? They're just Chinese, right? But the Northerners, and I'm not just talking about nomadic peoples, I'm talking about everybody in the Northern dynasties, primarily lived on dry grasses like wheat and millet, often made into porridge, though by this time they were making flour out of them and making things that are basically like jiaozi, like dumplings. They had very little access to rice and didn't mostly eat it. They ate a lot of meat from grazing animals like cows and sheep and goats, and they consumed a whole lot of fermented dairy products. They never drank tea, right? So their whole sort of approach to foodstuffs is very similar to the way that you would grow food and eat food all the way across Central Asia to Persia, right? They were also really proud of those habits. They thought they were superior. They thought they were a defining element of their own culture. And they thought the Southerners they looked down on the Southerners for their exotic and barbarian customs, like eating fish and turtles, which they thought was weird, and eating rice, which they called a swamp weed, and drinking tea, which was a weak and unworthy beverage. So I think what that tells us is that the Southerners have developed a cultural system around food, around language, around a lot of other things, which is really different from the culture of the North China Plains, and almost certainly was in the Han Dynasty as well, and continued to be in the Tang Dynasty too. And the reason why it seems Chinese to us now is because what we think of as Chinese has changed, right? It took centuries of cultural and material exchange facilitated by the Grand Canal to allow Southern customs like eating rice and drinking tea to become less exotic and in fact even normal to the Northern ruling class, right? So the Southerners develop a whole different cultural system that we now think of as sort of ordinarily Chinese, but absolutely was not thought of that way in the 5th and 6th centuries.
I'm just thinking about all these northern refugees who fled to the south and now they have to adapt to this whole new way of eating all this different cultural aspects. And it must have been quite a culture shock for them.
I'm sure it was. And one of the things that I read somewhere that, Northerners came to the South and taught the Southerners how to grow rice. And that's just a ridiculous assertion, right? I mean, rice technology, wet field rice technology is an extremely complicated way to grow food. And so the Southerners were expert at it and had been for a long time. Northerners had no idea what to do with a rice paddy, right? It was a completely alien way of growing food. They didn't know how to prepare food out of the kinds of animals and plants that grew in the South. So, they almost certainly had to adapt almost completely to living in a Southern context. They almost certainly had to learn Southern languages in order to get by and communicate with their neighbors. So this idea that the Northerners came to the South and brought their own culture and transformed the South is just completely backwards, right? The Northerners came to the South and probably within a few generations basically disappeared into the population of Southerners. They were a relatively small percentage of the population, and they had to learn Southern ways in order to survive. The only ones that don't do that, or at least don't do it in the same way, are the ones that are well off and really well educated and moved to the capital. And those ones who almost certainly changed their food habits did maintain their language and their culture and their cultural influence because they came from the Jin court and they were prestigious. And so the Southerners adopted a lot of that. But over time, by the time you get to the 5th and 6th centuries, it's pretty clear that even the northern migrants who live at the capital identify themselves with Jiankang, the Jiankang court, and the Southern Dynasties, and don't think of themselves somehow as what we might call ethnically related to people who are in the north.
Very interesting, yeah. So the Southern dynasties survived for more than a century. They successfully withstood several attempts by the northern regimes to conquer them, but ultimately they fall. And what I find interesting is that during this period, the Northern Wei had split into two rival states. So you have kind of a repeat of the Three Kingdoms situation, but instead of the Wei in the Three Kingdoms being the dominant power of the three, in this period, it seemed like all three regimes were somewhat on a power parity. So why in the end did the southern regimes fall if they had been so successful before in withstanding northern attacks, and especially when North China was divided?
Well, I point out a couple of things about that. The first, of course, that I pointed out before is they weren't that motivated to conquer the north, though Liang Emperor Wu does stage some northern campaigns to try and take advantage of the split in the north after the fall of the Northern Wei. They have, I think, a couple of more fundamental problems. One is that their military system remains highly decentralized. It's very much based on sort of patron-client relations and personal relations in the military. And so their military tended to be very fragmented and not highly coordinated. And so they were reasonably effective at defending their fortresses, which by this time were along the Huai River. But they were not particularly effective at projecting force further north in any kind of sustained way. Again, the shortage of horses is definitely a problem. Their inability to supply their troops because they can't use ships to go farther north is also a problem. So they still have the fundamental military problems that they had before, and they didn't apply themselves very aggressively to solving those. A second really fundamental problem for the southern regimes is they never really worked out a good system for succession. You know, if you study the sequence of southern rulers, and I don't just mean the four dynasties that are usually described, but every single ruler, all of the rulers that were able to exert very much power basically had their own personally committed, loyal band of military men around them. And so each time a ruler dies, you have a kind of struggle between different groups, different relatives of the ruler. Sometimes it's uncles, sometimes it's cousins, sometimes it's somebody who's not even related to the ruler that are fighting for supremacy. The designated heir, the ruler's eldest son, virtually never takes the throne in his own right because he's usually been sequestered away at court, doesn't have military backing. Somebody else virtually always winds up taking the throne. Sometimes it takes a couple of years to get a minor child or a weak official heir to be moved off the throne. But sooner or later that happens and somebody who has real military backing takes over. The result, however, is that there's this whole series of civil wars, right? Some bigger, some smaller, that sort of take all of the military energy of the Southern dynasties each time there's a succession. The worst of these is the Ho Jing rebellion after the death of Liang Emperor Wu. He'd been emperor for 48 years. And so a massive civil war was sort of in the making for whenever he died, trying to succeed him. And it was actually turned out to be a lot worse than anybody thought it would be. And that really gutted the city of Jiankang and undermined the entire military strength of the Southern dynasties. And by the time they were pulled back together again under the Chen dynasty, they'd lost all of the territory all the way down to the Yangtze River. And that left them very weak. In particular, they were weak because when the Northern dynasties control that much of the Yangtze watershed, then they can take places in Sichuan, for example, or at Xiangyang on the Han River in northern Hubei, and basically build a whole fleet, right? They can take their time to build a fleet and float it on the Yangtze River and then sail it downriver when they're ready to do that. And they can only do that if they control major ports on the Yangtze River watershed. And to do that, they have to have gotten that far south. And the collapse of the Jiankang regime in the middle of the 6th century allows them to move that far south, and they're able to build bases there. So when Sui Wendi manages to unite the two northern regimes and found his own dynasty, he's already sitting pretty in terms of his ability to build a military that can actually function on southern rivers and take over a Jiankang regime, which at that point probably had less than half the population that it had had at the beginning of the century. That sort of explains the military situation.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it reminds me of the Yuan conquest of the Southern Song, right? Where again, the Mongols had advanced so far down south that they can start building fleets. And it's somewhat ironic when you talk about the succession. When you hear about that kind of succession, you typically associate it with nomadic regimes, right? Because they practice tanistry, and whereas you think Chinese regimes had a stable succession, but in this case, it seemed like it was flipped, and it was the Chinese who were fighting all the time, and the Northerners seemed much more united.
The Northern succession regime seems to me to be a little bit more stable than the Southern one. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, again, we don't really recognize the extent to which the Southern regime is, it's not based on nomadic horsed nomads, but it's still based on military men whose allegiances tend to be through personal networks and therefore easily fragmented and brittle. And so we don't think about that for Southern regimes, but in fact, it's a hallmark of those regimes. I would just say in my book, I sort of compare that to regimes in Southeast Asia, which have similar kinds of problems. And you can see some similar dynamics in a kind of a big man style of politics that tends to be very fragmentary.
So Sui Wendi, like you said, was the guy who ultimately ended the Northern and Southern dynasties. He took over the Southern Chen and united China. But when we talk about the Sui and its successor, the Tang, we often like to point out the various Xianbei influence, the Northern Wei influence on them, things like the equal fields, or the Fubing military system, or this emphasis on aristocratic lineages. So what legacies, if any, did the Southern regimes leave on China? What are some of the reasons why the Southern regimes are so important to Chinese history? I'm thinking maybe, the Southern Song finds itself in a similar situation, having lost North China. Like, did they draw any connections with the Jiankang regimes?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think traditionally the Southern regimes have been the most appreciated for their contributions to literature, right? Especially Buddhist works and poetry, including some of the early great landscape poets of the Chinese tradition, like Tao Yanming and Xie Lingyun, and all of the sort of poetic reforms that happened in the Southern Qi and Liang courts, for example. So they've been studied very heavily for that, for Taoist writings, for Buddhist writings. In terms of literature and that kind of work, the Southern dynasties are tremendously important. If we think about their political legacy, on the other hand, it's a lot trickier. The Southern regimes, of course, suffer from being eventually conquered by the North. No one wants to model themselves on a regime that gets conquered. But there's some evidence that the 10th century Southern regimes, especially the Wu and Southern Tang regimes, actually attempted to revive some of Jiankang symbolism and legacy. But it's true, I haven't gone forward to look at the Southern Song. I would be surprised if the Southern Song looked back to Jiankang as a model, only because Jiankang doesn't win, right? So it seems a little problematic to use that as a model. And so you're much more likely to use something that seemed victorious. Another point political legacy is that in the larger course of history, China, as we call it, is understood to have been great only when it was unified, right? The Sui and Tang unified China. That's a great thing that leads to Chinese greatness. But the flip side of that is that the elimination of the Jiankang regime is a necessary prerequisite to the rise of Chinese greatness, right? You can't have greatness unless you get rid of the Southerners by the Sui and the Tang. What that means is that the study of Jiankang's political system tends to be de-emphasized by later historians. As I pointed out, they usually write it off as being corrupt and incompetent, and that's why it failed, basically. And, my reply to that is it's only corrupt and incompetent if you compare it to some sort of ideal of what a regime is supposed to be. When you look at most regimes around the world, it's actually run reasonably well. And the proof is that it survived for almost 4 centuries. So it's actually a pretty stable regime that develops a really important political legacy. It's just been marginalized in China's history. The other, maybe the most important part of the legacy, besides the literature, is the South's commercial economy. By the early 6th century, the city of Jiankang is not only commercially incredibly vibrant, it's probably also the world's largest city. It has a population of somewhere between 50,000 and 750,000 people. So it's bigger than any city in the world. Maybe Luoyang got to be that large, but remember, Luoyang only lasts for about 35 years, I think, whereas Jiankang had existed for 400 at that point. So it's just a much more mature big city. And when the Sui take over, of course, they level the whole city. I don't think we quite appreciate that they took the world's largest city and basically burned the whole thing and leveled it out into fields. And so subsequently, they made the city of Yangzhou, which is just downriver from Jiankang, into the primary center of Sui and Tang power in the lower Yangtze region. And Yangzhou becomes obviously an enormous economic engine. All Yangzhou's doing is taking over all of the role that Jiankang had once held. It's just all moved to Yangzhou. And Yangzhou, being the southern terminus of the Grand Canal, is a kind of a southern example of Sui and Tang power, right? Rather than an independent source of power the way that Jiankang was. Also, of course, by the late Tang and into the Song, what's known as the Tang-Song transition, a whole lot of elements which were pioneered by the Jiankang regime reappear, right? For example, the intensive monetization of the economy that we look at in the Song period had already been tried, somewhat less successfully, but absolutely had been done in the Jiankang era. The use of commercial taxes, which becomes really important in the Song period, had been pioneered by the Jiankang regime and was started up again under some of the Southern Dynasties in the 10th century. The strong ties with maritime Asia, which were so important for the Jiankang regime, again, resurfaced very strongly in the late Tang and the Song period. All of those things built on a foundation that had been laid in the 4 centuries in which the South had been independent prior to the imposition of rule by the Sui and Tang.
I was just thinking, Sui Wendi also destroyed Yecheng. So he's really into destroying major centers of political power.
He wants to get rid of any possible rivals. Absolutely.
Also, just one quick point. I also read that when the Sui Tang unified China, they typically didn't implement a lot of the policies from the north into South China, like the equal fields, the Fubing. Is that true? They had a more native administration going on for South China?
There's a whole lot of ways in which I think the Sui and Tang rule over South China can be seen as a kind of colonial rule in that they're not really fully integrated into the empire. As you point out, they don't really extend the equal field system and census and registration. If you look at the Sui census of the South, for example, they've clearly grossly undercounted the number of people in the southern districts. I suspect they just took the numbers that the Jiankang regime had and used those, and those are massively undercounted, right? The northern census system is much better than the southern one, and the Sui didn't basically extend that system to the south. By the census in the mid-Tang, they probably have extended it to a good deal of the south, but it takes a long time. Similarly, if you think about the imperial recruitment system, if you look at how that works, Southerners were basically not recruited into imperial administration. There's a kind of a lower tier of administration for Southern districts, which Southerners were allowed to be in, but they weren't allowed to sort of cycle in that system up into the system of the metropole. at Chang'an and Luoyang, right? So that's very similar to how we see some other empires function, right? Like the British Empire, for example, allowed local people to serve in local places, but they weren't allowed to go back to England to serve, right? So you can see some of those colonial ways of administering the South in the Tang period, which I think means that the South is not really, I mean, it's a unified empire, sure, but the South is not really integrated into the imperial system in the same way that the North is.
It's interesting. And again, I'm seeing some parallels with the Mongols and how they administered South China as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, we covered quite a bit of history in the Southern Dynasties. And I want to thank you, Professor Chittick. I actually learned some new things as well. And I think it's really important because a lot of the stuff that we tend to think happened later in history, like commercial taxes, maritime trade, right? It actually developed much earlier than that in the Southern regimes during this period. And I think for a long time, it's been overlooked, overshadowed. So I really appreciate you coming onto the show and giving us some of this new scholarship, new findings. And for anyone who's interested, I would highly recommend them to read your book.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to be here, Yiming. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
All right. Well, then that concludes our interview. Thank you so much for listening to the Chinese History Podcast.